Alrighty, so welcome to the first module of the course. This matches up with chapter 1 from our book. You'll see that a lot of the material I cover there, in terms of the narrated slides, track pretty closely with what's in chapter 1 of our book. So this is just going to be a broad overview of the module. For the details, for the finer details, check out those narrated slides and read chapter 1. All right, so first thing I want to talk about here is this idea of the United States being a constitutional democracy. Some call it a republic, right? You hear that from time to time from various quarters. Carlton, what are you doing? We were never meant to be a democracy. We're not a democracy. We're a republic if you can keep it. The Ben Franklin quote from maybe apocryphal, maybe true. After the convention was over in 1787 in Philadelphia, right, he was asked by a woman, what have you all been doing in there the last few months? Summer, 1787. Right, and he said, we were creating a republic if you can keep it. Right, so fair enough. That was the terminology used by the Founding Fathers. They actually defined democracy in very pejorative terms as ruled by the anarchic mob, all right, without the rule of law. So what do I want to say about that? Couple things. One, right, in some ways the founders were not creating a democracy the way we think of it today, back then, right? Because what did they build into the Constitution? We'll see. Slavery, right? That's clearly, profoundly anti-democratic. Were they creating a situation where we would have universal adult suffrage? Heck no. Right? They left it up to the states, who predictably fenced out everybody except propertied white men in terms of who could vote. Right, so in that sense, not a democracy by today's standards. So just looking at it that way, right, you could argue they never intended to create a democracy. Right, well, it was the 18th century, right? For their time, they were quite progressive, quite cutting edge. But we would say, right, for us, that was a starting point, a useful starting point, perhaps. And over time, we have become democratic, right? We got rid of slavery. We made suffrage universal, almost universal for adults, citizens. All right, and now we take the Bill of Rights seriously. Back then we really didn't. Okay, it was there on parchment, but not really in practice. Fundamental rights and liberties, right? So, if it is true that they were never meaning to create a democracy, that might there's something to that, but. Regardless, right, that's what we've done over time. And I think it's to our great credit. We've made America a lot more democratic than we started out as. Right? And I'm not going to apologize for that. It's a good thing in my humble view. So there's one argument about that. All right? Yes, but. Second argument, right, would be, look, if someone says a republic today, number one, right, that term is incredibly vague. What does it mean? The name, the language, the string of letters there doesn't really imply anything. It could be anything. Like it's like a Rorschach ink blot test. What is a republic? I don't know. The name doesn't really tell me anything. Right? So what would I say? Right? When we say when people today say republic, what they really mean, effectively, the same damn thing is, but there's a better term for that. Is constitutional democracy, right? In which we do have democracy, right? Power to the people, popular sovereignty, right? Ruled by the majority for the most part, through free and fair elections. Again, I'm not going to apologize for that. Those are good things. I lost my string of thought here, but so we do have rule by the majority. But we also have, right, all of the things that you would expect that go along with that when you say constitutional democracy. We have a Bill of Rights that protects the minority from the majority, right? We have a Bill of Rights that protects things like unpopular speech. It protects those accused of crime. It protects in some ways, right, the most vulnerable among us, the least popular. And right, we've also modified that over time, haven't we, through subsequent amendments like the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection of the law. So we have, right, ruled by the majority, democracy. But as part of that, right, we have the rule of law. We have the Bill of Rights. We have limits on the power of the majority. We have checks and balances and all that good stuff that people mean when they say republic. So to me, it's at some level that debate is tomato, tomato, potato, potato. Let's call the whole thing off. Right? A constitutional democracy is the same thing as a republic. So it becomes a bit of a semantic game. I do worry a little bit sometimes when people say, we were never meant to be a democracy, Carlton, we're a republic. What they're really kind of saying is, right, I think, they have this sense that increasingly their sort of perspective is no longer honored by the majority. It's increasingly marginal. And so they feel a need to argue against democracy because it means they won't be able to hold power because it's an increasingly marginal position. And so they're saying, well, democracy is a terrible thing. As Winston Churchill said, right, democracy is the worst possible form of governance, with the exception of all the alternatives, which are even worse. The old backhanded compliment to democracy. Because what are the alternatives, right? Ruled by the minority. Is that what advocates of a republic are saying? That we're in the minority, therefore we think the minority should rule, and somehow the minority has all of these virtues that the majority don't possess? Oh, come on, man. Get out of here. I'm not interested in that bullshit. So a little note there. And it helps yield, right, some good insights analytically into what does it mean to be a constitutional democracy. So in that sense, the debate's useful. But at some level, I find it either trivial, like a game of words, or I find it disturbing because it masks kind of an agenda that is in some ways perhaps anti-democratic. All right. The alternative to democracy today in the world, right, is authoritarianism, centralized power in the hands of one person, typically sort of a rule by a strong man without limits, with no checks and balances, typically a charismatic individual that's a demagogue, kind of a toxic form of populism. That's the threat to democracy, right? Good exemplars today would be Vladimir Putin in Russia, right? President Xi in China. Increasingly, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Whoever the hell's in power these days in Cuba. I think maybe it's Fidel Castro's younger brother, who's still a lot older than even Joe Biden. The dude over in North Korea. Okay, so that's the alternative to democracy, right? Unfettered power held by a single individual who functions by cult of personality. That's a rising threat in the world. If you think that's a threat, I think it is. Again, I'm not going to apologize for defending constitutional democracy as a preferred form of governance, with all of its terrible flaws and vices. The alternative is far worse. Churchill was right. Yeah, right. And it's on the march these days. It's an increasingly popular form of governance. Most of world history is the history of authoritarian regimes. Democracy is a recent invention dating back to about the 18th century. It's a chancy proposition. It's not well established. It is flawed. And authoritarianism, things are sort of swinging their way these days. Now, President Putin in Russia is a very happy man these days in some ways. Xi in China. They think the future is theirs. I hope it's not. So we do see a rise in authoritarian forms of governance. It is estimated these days that about half of the world lives under authoritarian regimes. About half live in democracies. We're right, sort of a tipping point. And look, it's a global phenomenon. This rise of authoritarianism and the degradation of democracy. It's happening in the United States. Now, we were, I think, counted until about 10 years ago as sort of a strong democracy, a quality democracy. today we're considered to be a significantly flawed democracy. By the way, we rank around 25th in the world in terms of the quality of our democracy. We're an okay democracy. We're very affluent economically. We're the most powerful nation in the world by far militarily. But in terms of the quality of our democracy, by most measures, we're pretty far down the list. I'll take top 25. I'm not going to get greedy. I wish we were higher up in the hierarchy, but we're not. But I'll take 25th. It means we're a flawed democracy, but we're still a democracy. Are there forces within the U.S. that want to make us more authoritarian? Of course there are. I'm not going to mince words here. Donald Trump. There are Donald Trumps now across the globe. He wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. But he's a good representative of this trend towards authoritarian forms of governance where you want to centralize power in a single individual with as few checks and balances as possible, functioning by cult of personality. Quick insight into that. The Republican Party in 2020 at their convention where they nominated Trump to run for the presidency against Joe Biden, they didn't even create a party platform at that convention. First time, as in my knowledge, first time that's ever happened at a party convention prior to a presidential election. They didn't create a party platform because their view was, whatever Trump says on a given day, which it can vary from one week to the next, one day to the next, hell, 1 hour to the next. So they said, we don't have a party platform. It's whatever this dude says on any given day. If that's not sort of cult of personality politics, I don't know what is, right? That the party has become utterly dominated by one person. You'll notice the Democratic Party is not particularly dominated by Joe Biden. He's their standard bearer, right? Their national representative, but he doesn't dominate the party the way that Trump dominates the Republican Party. So yeah, we have domestic threats to a democracy, and it's very appealing to many people. It always has been throughout human history. Authoritarianism has a lot to offer. I hate to say that, but it's true. It has a lot to offer. It absolves we the people of responsibility for governing themselves, which is a real pain in the ass. Right? It just says, there's a strong man who can take care of things for us. He'll keep us safe. And I can go about my private life. That's very appealing to millions, hundreds of millions, globally, billions of people. Here in America, tens of millions of people find that super attractive. Let this dude take care of it. Give him the power. I understand. He'll protect us. He'll rescue us. And this is happening across the globe. Other democracies are under similar threats. Regimes that until 10 years ago were authoritarian are becoming more authoritarian. Regimes that were democratic are becoming less democratic. It's happening everywhere. It's all quite worrisome, to put it mildly. And where it's all going to end, I have no idea. There are some signs that trend has crested, and other signs that maybe it hasn't. So we'll see where history takes us. We're living in interesting times. And many pinpoint, not very precisely, but they pinpoint it to globalism. As the world has become more integrated economically, especially, right? And borders, nation-state borders have become more fluid and less important because we're so interconnected. Global trade and supply chains and all of that. That people find that very threatening within nation states, right? It threatens to upend the status quo of nation states being the dominant players on the global stage. It creates mobility of labor, mobility of capital, rapid changes, technological evolution that's accelerating. People find all of that very threatening and disturbing, and they feel like they need to be protected from these large global forces. Right? Close down the borders. Reverse the trend of globalization, go back to an earlier state of affairs when life was simpler and the world hadn't gotten so small and interconnected. So that's what most scholars believe, is that's what's generating a desire for authoritarian regimes, protection, safety, backlash, close the borders, reprioritize the nation state, etc. All right. And switching gears a little bit now. in terms of our own American democracy, right, you would say that what drives our democracy at some base level is our political culture that we have, things that we believe as a people. What do we believe as a people? We believe, at least I think, somewhat questionably these days, but still, right, the value of democracy, rule by the majority for the most part, fundamental rights and liberties for the minority, right, protections for the minority as well, the rule of law, an independent media, free and fair elections, one person, one vote. Okay, these are things that we still value, I think, as a people, although it's under pressure because people have so little trust now in all of these institutions, right? That's what worries me about Trump here. He sows distrust about basic things that used to seem solid, right? Like elections, like the media, like the rule of law, the judiciary, right? Because if you can sow enough distrust about these governing institutions, right, the only thing that's left is a single individual who will promise to fix all of these problems. Trust me. Trust me. Yeah, it's the personalization of power. And a lot of people find that attractive. I don't. I'm a political scientist. I value institutional forms of governance that aren't as exciting, but are, I think, better for we the people. But we the people get to choose, right? If we choose not to be democratic anymore, we can do that. But for now, at least, right, we're still committed, I think, to the basic premises of what it means to be a constitutional democracy. We're also committed, I think, to this thing called classical liberalism. Check it out on the slides. Relatively free markets in terms of how we organize the economy as the most efficient, productive way to organize the economy. And I do say relatively free, right? We do have regulations. We do have, government interventions. We do have a welfare state, but relatively free market economy. The centrality of private property as an institution that makes a free market possible, right? That if you own property and you invest in that property, and there are gains that come out of your labor, right? You get to keep most of those gains yourself. They don't just go pell-mell to everybody else. Right. And you can't take that for granted necessarily. There are countries in the world today that don't adequately protect private property, and it reduces the incentive of people to invest their labor into the land, and then your economy goes to shit. Right. People have to have a sense of stability and a bit of a guarantee that if you invest your labor in some project like a business, that you can keep most of the fruits of that labor. Obviously, you got to pay taxes for to have a civilized society. Check out John Locke on that in our book and in the note and the narrated slides. And we also have a tradition, quite honestly, of trying to look at this. Sorry, inegalitarianism. We do, right? It's a genuine tradition. It's built into the fabric of our country and our history, right from the get-go. Right, we commit the original sin of slavery. So we have that deep tradition. We just do, often based on race. And not just black and white, obviously, right? But also indigenous people, Asian Americans, Latinos. It can be a gender-based form of inequality, right? Think about women, right? Don't get guaranteed the right to vote nationally until the early 20th century. Think about the LGBT community, historically put at the bottom of the hierarchy. Current battles over transgender individuals and so on, right? There is a deep tradition there. It resonates today. It shapes us. History shapes us always, right? You know how as an individual, if you were trying to explain yourself to somebody, you'd have to talk about your history, right? Who your parents are, who your siblings are, where you're from, your experiences in the past, right? That's who you are today, the sum of all of that. Nation states are the same way, right? We can't tell the story of America in a way that makes sense of our politics today without weighing history as a major factor. Things like slavery, Japanese-American internment during World War II, after Pearl Harbor, The treatment of Chinese immigrants after the building of the Trans-Pacific Railroad. Check all that out, people. It's in the slides and in the book. Class inequalities, historically and today. We do have those traditions, right? We do. We're not perfect. We're far from it. Have we gotten better over time? I believe that we have. I try to be optimistic. I think we've made a lot of progress. Sometimes we slide backwards. Sometimes we jolt forward. I think the long arc is progress, but within that long arc there are retrograde motions, no question about that. So we do have that tradition of inegalitarianism that we don't celebrate, but I think we need to acknowledge. Otherwise you can't make sense of politics today. And it's just not accurate to not take that into account. It's just not accurate. It's not empirically, analytically accurate. Big facts. And then what do I have there? Oh, yeah, right. Our shifting demographics. The demographics of any country are always shifting. Right? Life is dynamic by its very nature. All right. Historically, we have been an overwhelmingly white country. More recently, post 1965 in particular, right, we've become a lot more racially and ethnically diverse. That was largely due to a change in federal immigration law in 1965 under President Lyndon B. Johnson. Right, that was a decade, the 1960s, right, a decade of the growth of democracy in America, which some look back upon fondly and others look back upon with suspicion and regret. I fit into that first camp and not the second camp. And part of that was we democratized immigration law to make America more accessible to non-white people from across the globe. So what came about as a result of that federal immigration law? A lot more immigration from Latin America, south of our border, and from the east, from Asia. So that's when we start to build, right, a much larger Latino and Asian American community. Is post-1965, right up to today, right? I think in 1965 we were over 90% white. I think significantly over 90% white, or something close to that. And today, right, we're about 57% white. And most of that has been the growth of the Latino community. Now it's around 20% of us. And the Asian American community, which is actually growing faster than the Latino community. But the base numbers are much smaller, about 7% nationally. What does that mean for our politics? A lot, right? Because we'll see, right? The voting patterns among non-white Americans tends to be more liberal, more Democratic Party. The voting patterns of white Americans tends to be more conservative, more Republican. So as we become more racially diverse, right, that's shifted our politics a bit. Certainly it has here in Nevada. So that's been important to understanding changes in our politics, right? And increasingly, the Republican Party is responding to that. They recognize that, right, as, it's both a threat, because the Republican Party still is predominantly a white political party, but it also is an opportunity for them, right, to grow by seeking to appeal more and more to the Latino community, which they're doing a pretty good job of, quite honestly. Right? So they see that as an opportunity, but also, a potential concern. Yes, they're making a hard play for the Latino vote. Donald Trump's making a hard play for the Latino vote, and there's evidence that he's doing all right. I mean, he's not going to win the Latino vote. That would be insane. He's not going to win the Asian American vote. Crazy talk. But, if he increases his share of those communities in terms of the vote in November, he's got a good chance of winning the presidency. That's what Democrats are worried about, I assure you. I assure you of that. And also, right, shifting age demographics. Like other sort of Western-style affluent societies, we're getting older pretty quickly. Young people are reproducing less. People are living longer. So you're getting sort of an age bulge towards the end of that age timeline. So we're getting older pretty quickly. I think our birth rate now is around 1.7 kids per woman on average. Replacement, just to stay stable population-wise, is 2.1. We're at 1.7. America's not shrinking yet, right? Partly because of immigration, largely because of immigration. Yeah, unless we change our immigration policies to be a bit more open, we're going to start shrinking pretty soon. Japan, I believe, is the furthest along that cycle. Their birth rate, wait for it, is about 1 kid, 1.0 per woman on average. Okay. They're aging more quickly than we are. And the reason we're also not shrinking is, right, people are living longer, and that's a fairly recent development. But it's clear that if these trends continue, and evidence is that they will continue, our birth rate's going to drop. It's not going to rise. It's not going to stay stable. It's going to come down. We're headed towards where Japan is now. Okay, and as people do start to die off, we're going to shrink our population. And what it also means, right, is you got a whole lot of older people who are retired and relatively few younger people working. That's a problem. That's an economic problem. That's a governmental policy problem with things like Social Security and Medicare, right? Because we do a pay-as-you-go approach to those programs. Those are our 2 big domestic programs. They dominate our domestic budget, exclusive of the military. And those programs are under growing fiscal stress because there's more and more retirees and fewer workers. And we're living longer and longer, and we expect cutting-edge medical care. And then the cost of cutting-edge medical care and pharmaceuticals is going up faster than the rate of inflation by a bit. So that's becoming a little bit of a fiscal train wreck down the road a little ways here. That's one of the problems with an aging society that's starting to shrink. Along the way, it is extremely stressful. And that can accelerate, right? It becomes almost like a doom loop. It becomes like a doom loop, right? Because you have fewer young people now reproducing. The next generation of kids, right, as they reach the age of reproduction, there'll be fewer of them to reproduce at lower rates, and on and on. You get a little bit of a doom loop there. So, now look, Japan. President Biden said this the other day, and he was right. I know it wasn't the correct thing to say, but he was right. He said Japan, our ally, a fellow democracy, you know, they're a little bit, I forget what he said exactly, but they're basically, right, very anti-foreigner, therefore anti-immigration, xenophobic. He said they were xenophobic. He's not wrong. Well, Japan's screwed, I think, because they're xenophobic and they're shrinking and they're getting old and they won't accept immigration. Wow. I don't know. You're in a corner, dude. Japan, you are in a corner of your own making. You better get right. I don't know. So, you know, I don't have to get elected so I can say these things. If anything, I think the U.S. needs more immigration going forward. That's just my own view, to deal with this demographic problem of an aging society that's starting to shrink. Because immigrants overwhelmingly are young people with a strong desire to work. Sounds like the answer to our prayers in all sorts of ways, to me. But I don't have to get elected. Because I wouldn't get elected with that as a platform, people. I would get like 3 votes on election day, and I'm okay with that. All right. So that's my introduction. That's what you're going to find there in that material. This is the broad overview. Thanks.